Hi, and welcome to CryptoBiography. I'm your host, Brandon Starr, and this is episode 217, and it is part 12 of Snake Magic. And here we go. The hut they stayed in was quite simple and, it seemed to Neidre, rather human-based. There were 2 beds in there. Neidre had seen beds only a few times when she had been asked to take food up to sick humans on the estate. The mattress was straw in a fabric bag, but seemed similar enough to her loose straw bedding at the estate in the basement. She curled up and found it quite comfortable. She looked at Heffred, who was clearly taking her time getting settled on the other bed. "Not like your bed at home?" she asked. Heffred chuckled. "No, it seems like it would be comfortable enough, though." She finally laid down properly. "I suppose I have a lot to learn." "Yes, but I can learn from you, too. I find it interesting that you asked about the town being a day's walk away. We would say a day's travel. We only use the word walk when the one doing the movement has legs." "I see," Neidre said. She reflexively reached down and stroked her tail. Heffred was being kind, but she still felt the early stirrings of embarrassment. Since Heffred wasn't looking at her, she reached down to her newly green scale and scratched at it. She remembered that her tail sock was with the cook wagon and must be on its way back to Caedmon's estate. Someone would be taking over her cooking duties. What would they do with her tail sock? Throw it away on the side of the road, to be forgotten until its wool, so much of it given to her by her friend Martha, rotted away? Bring it back to the estate and use it as a rag? Whatever would happen to it, she would never know. She found herself strangely sad about it. Her life with the humans was degrading, awful, and cramped. But she had made herself a tail sock out of wool she had saved up slowly and painfully to buy, aided by the wool from her friend, and she missed it. It wasn't even cool inside the hut, yet she missed it. The next morning, they headed towards the town. Neidre realized that she had never heard a name for it, yet she couldn't find a place to ask Heffred what it was. For the most part, they slithered on narrow pathways which looked like deer paths to Neidre. She wondered if all the paths would be as narrow. She also noticed that the path narrowly avoided sharp rocks, the kind which human trails tended to roll straight past, as humans would walk over small, uncomfortable objects. Eventually they came to a river. It was fast, with rapids moving swiftly over sharp-looking rocks. "How do we cross?" Neidre asked. "The bridge. Do you not see it?" Heffred asked. Neidre looked around. There was no bridge, as she would think of it, a footbridge. But then she looked again, and saw that there was a stout tree trunk fallen over the span. And then she saw that it had not fallen by accident, but had been laid across it. And when she looked more closely, as they approached, it was clear that the trunk, that though round, had been blocked on either side by wedges that kept it in place. So while it would be a very difficult span indeed to cross on foot, she and Heffred would have no trouble at all. Their tails would grip it by enough angles at the same time to ensure that they could not fall the 50 feet or more into the gorge. And it was so, though the trunk was wet from mist from the raging river, and indeed slippery with moss and slime. They had no trouble at all traversing it. It was almost an hour later, slithering along another trail, this one certainly meant for someone with her body type, that she realized what had happened. She had used an object designed for a nasrach. Even her bed at home, which she had made, had not really been designed for her. The place was simply where she had been told to make her bed, and she had taken her cue from the bedding of the humans around her. When she had looked for a bridge, she had literally looked for a footbridge, a bridge meant for feet, wide, flat-topped. She had not looked for something that would be especially useful for her. But that bridge had been placed and made by nasrach for nasrach, and, she suspected, it had been made especially so nasrach could easily traverse it, while humans would be slowed by it, and indeed put in danger if they tried to use it. I'm in a nasrach land, she thought. And that thought stuck with her, made her almost dizzy with its ramifications. Once or twice she had noticed Hefrid looking at her, and she could swear that she had a bit of a smile. She hoped it was a good sign. After they stopped to rest and have a bit of food Hefrid had gotten the night before, Neidre wondered how close they were. Hefrid seemed to sense her question. We're quite close. So close that if we were any closer, I wouldn't bother eating until we got there. Neidre nodded. She had finished her meal and stood up. Then she realized that stood up was a human phrase that didn't really relate to her body. What do you say instead of standing up? She asked Hefrid. We say getting up, she replied. I'll bet there are a lot of little differences like that, Neidre said. Sure, Hefrid agreed. But we mostly speak our own tongue amongst ourselves, which is created around our own physicality. She saw Neidre's look and added, Don't worry, I'm sure you'll pick it up very quickly. Let's go. An hour later, following paths that were almost not paths at all, Neidre suspected that Hefrid was taking her by lesser-traveled ways, though she was not sure why. They stopped at the top of a small hill. There it is. Dinasgar. Neidre looked, and could make out more or less a city. There were stone buildings on the ground, including some large ones, but they were almost entirely covered by many enormous trees. The effect was to almost hide the city. There were some nasrach visible, but not many. I don't know what to say, Neidre said. It's a city you need to experience rather than see, Hefrid said. Let's go. Neidre supposed that, other than the abundance of arboreal beauty, the other strange things about the city was its strict boundaries. There were no outbuildings, no farms all around. Outside of the city was nothing but a few paths and what seemed to Neidre to be raw nature. Where are the farms? Neidre asked aloud. We do not farm, Hefrid replied. We multiply. Multiply your food? By magic? Neidre asked. Precisely, Hefrid said. Are you ready? And as she said it, they slid under the outermost trees and between the outermost buildings. This way, Hefrid said, and she started sliding up an enormous root that made its way over the nearest building and up towards one of the large trees, the name of which Neidre didn't know. Where the root met the trunk, many pegs, all about as thick as Neidre's forearm and spaced out with a good few feet between them, stuck out a couple of feet from the trunk. They had clearly been put there by the nasrach, and Hefrid beckoned her as she mounted the equivalent of a set of stairs, her long tail easily stretching from one to the next to the next. They stuck out far enough, Neidre saw, that two nasrach could pass each other, one coming up and one going down. Humans, she thought, would have a hard time getting up them at all, and would find the effort enormously taxing and even dangerous. She followed, and found it nearly as easy as going up a set of human stairs. Her tail made it so there was no chance of falling, even with her entire human body vertical and not touching the slither pegs or the tree trunk at all. They went up the pegs until they reached a large horizontal branch some 60 feet above the ground. This immediately broadened out to a floor, which had been partly formed by the branch being trained and partly finished by wood planking. There were several nasrach there. This was an eating area, and some were eating at tables. Neidre had never really found much need for a chair, and here none of the nasrach were seated. Looking up, Neidre saw above a canopy which could keep the sun and rain off, though at the moment it was rolled back. There was enough foliage that Neidre found it very comfortable. Neidre also saw that further up there were other platforms and other branches, though coming out at other angles from the tree, so none were directly above. Some of the nasrach had noticed that a stranger was among them and was looking at Neidre. She tried to pay as little attention to them as possible. How do they know I'm a stranger here? She whispered to Hefrid. Does everyone know each other by sight? The city seems large enough to prevent that. No, there are thousands here, Hefrid said. It's the color thing. Few of your age don't have their scales fully colored. Of course, Neidre said. All she wanted now was to learn enough magic to cause her tail to fill in its color. And that is the end of the episode for this week. I hope you enjoyed it. I really had a lot of fun writing it. And yeah, in fact, I tweeted out earlier, because there was a part kind of early in this episode where I had a pretty good stiff drink or two, essentially. And the writing was getting a little silly. It took a little extra editing this time to sort of whip it into shape. And there might be a few parts that actually even seem a little odd or a little unusual for my style. And that's probably what it is. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any comments or questions about this episode or previous episodes, CryptoBiography@gmail.com, or hit us up on Facebook or Twitter. And thanks for listening. Words and music copyright 2021, CryptoBiography LLC, all rights reserved. Characters and events are fictional, fictionalized, or satirical.